When you're playing a video game, what breaks your immersion the most? Could it be a glitch that disrupts the game, or maybe a poorly written story, or stiff game mechanics, or maybe an unnecessary romance? That's what I wanted to explore today. Do gamers even like romance in their video games? I won't be able to give a simple answer to that question because I think it's more complicated than a simple yes or no. I personally don't mind romance in video games. I don't love it or hate it. Sometimes I think it's done well, sometimes it's not. But I don't judge whether I like a game based on if it has romance. I judge based on its quality, because not all stories are enjoyable, and that goes beyond simply the presence of romance. I believe most gamers think like this too. I scrolled through hundreds of Steam reviews to see if I could find other people's opinions on romance in video games, and it barely came up. The only times I saw romance mentioned was when they were listing features of the game. I couldn't find anyone that said their opinion on the romance itself. So ask yourself the question: do you like romance in your video games? Is it more complicated than a simple yes or no? So, the more I thought about the question, the more I thought about romance in video games, and it made me realize something. Compared to other media like movies, books, TV shows, and especially music, video games have a surprising lack of romance. A study on the psychology of music determined about 67% of lyrics in every song every decade since the 60s were somehow about love. Even a lot of TV shows and movies have some sort of romance in them, even if it's not their main focus. So then it came to my shock when I started to scroll through my game library and try to count how many games I owned that had romance in them. And it took forever. Out of my 139 Steam games, I could only count 5 that had romance in them that I remembered. Those games were Stardew Valley, Baldur's Gate 3, Cyberpunk 2077, Persona 5, and Marvel Spider-Man 2. Of course, I could have miscounted, and it's dependent on my taste in video games, so it makes sense why I didn't find that many. But it's still surprising to me that less than 4% of the games I've played had romance. So, why is this? Why do video games seem to lack romance in them? Well, I think it's due to gamers liking control, and developers catering to that control. But giving too much control would make a game too complicated and resource heavy to make, and giving too little control would make a game boring. So that sweet spot, in my opinion, doesn't seem to encourage romance. 4 out of the 5 games I mentioned earlier share one aspect when it comes to romance. It is completely optional. The player can choose to interact with the romance or just ignore it. The exception is Spider-Man 2, and since the game is based off of the comics, it makes sense why the romance isn't optional. So then it's no wonder I never hear anyone complain about romance in video games, because most of the time it's optional, and if you don't like it, you don't have to interact with it. Video games are specifically designed for the player to have some amount of control over, and each game has its own level of control that it gives you. But have you noticed that most of the time, whenever the player is given the control to make their own character, is when they have the most control over the story? For example, in Spider-Man 2, you don't create your own character, you play as Peter Parker. So you have pretty much no control over the story, just how fast you progress through it. In a game like Baldur's Gate 3, you're given a lot of control. You create your own character. There are multiple dialogue options, different endings to the game, and many actions you can take that affect the story in some way. So then it got me thinking, the worst feeling in video games is feeling like you have no control. Just think for a second. You start playing a video game, you create your own character, give them a name, and create in your mind their ideals and motives. Then imagine you're playing through the story and your character you created falls in love with someone you didn't want them to. It would be infuriating. When I'm playing an open world game and I find an invisible wall, it's a bit annoying. When any video game glitches out and I die out of nowhere, it's frustrating. When a story-focused game gives me a choice, but it doesn't change the outcome, it's disappointing. When a video game's level of control is inconsistent with itself, that's when players most likely start having a negative experience with the game. So ultimately, do gamers like romance in their video games? I think a game's enjoyability is not dependent on the romance, and a romance's enjoyability is not dependent on its existence. It's dependent on the execution and a bit of personal preference. Most gamers would not play a game like Minecraft to specifically avoid romance, and vice versa. Most gamers wouldn't play a game like Stardew Valley only for its romance. You play a game for what it is and everything it has to offer, and like or dislike it for those reasons, not romance alone.